Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Revitalizing Innovation. We are so glad that you are joining us today. My name is Nicola Corzine, and I have the honor of being the founding executive director and CEO of the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're so glad you're here. The center is a nonprofit that is committed to building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide, and we do that with a commitment to improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. As you may have seen already in the chat, the Nasdaq Center is committed to providing programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to every entrepreneur around the world, across all industries, across all stages and geographies. We encourage you to check out some of those links and resources. Share them around. It takes a village in entrepreneurship, and we're glad you're part of that now. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started with today's great session. First, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. So if you haven't already, please share where you're joining us from today, geography and organization. Second of all, just a note, we are going to be opening up for live Q&A at the end of this session. And as with everything that the center does, we try to make it as personalized and as custom to your needs and your interests as possible. So don't be shy. Use that Q&A function at the bottom. Let us know your questions as we're going through today's research, as we're having a conversation today, and we'll try to get to just as many as we possibly can. Everything that the center offers, all of our programs, our research, our support, is made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of the foundations, the funders, and the donors who believe in the work of the center. So to all of them, we say a big heartfelt thank you, especially in these times. And especially today, would like to recognize the generosity of Nasdaq and JP Morgan Chase, who made this research possible and have been working with us for many years now on the incredible support for entrepreneurs worldwide. Now, without any more delay, I would like to get started with a little bit of what we're going to be covering today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and open it up to our conversation. Revitalizing Innovation is a project that has been underway now for 3 years. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the genesis of that program, why it got started. Then we're going to have the honor of hearing from our two amazing friends, research collaborators and partners, Heartland Forward and Penn State University. And then we're going to look at some of the highlights that have come out of this. We're going to talk through some of our equity innovation leaders that have emerged. And finally, we're going to look at some of these shining case studies who are progressing forward in really exciting and innovative ways, equity and entrepreneurship across America. So let's get started. The Venture Equity Project is a multi-year program that is supported, as I shared earlier, with JP Morgan Chase and Nasdaq. It was launched in 2021 with a belief that if we could identify first movers in this field of advancing equity and entrepreneurship, then more could be done to accelerate equitable outcomes for entrepreneurs across the United States. We learned a lot in those first couple of years. And one of the core things that emerged was, interestingly, intersectionality of geography really matters when you're looking at where and how entrepreneurs can be successful. So what we wanted to do is focusing on expanding venture capital access for our underrepresented entrepreneurs. What might we be able to find and discover as we look through the lens of research and policy recommendations to inform and guide others? We always say at the center, and I'm sure all of you can appreciate this, we make a lot of investment in that first mile. And sometimes it seems like we step and repeat the same experiments over and over again. And now more than ever, resources are hard to come by. So our goal, our hope with all of this is to be able to share a compass, a bit of a blueprint, if you will, for how we can accelerate outcomes of equity in America by looking at what states are being able to drive forward with innovative approaches that can actually ensure greater access and equity for venture aspiring and venture-backed founders in America. So this time through, in our second phase of work, we had a chance to bring together two incredible research partners that you're going to hear from in just a minute, I promise. First is Heartland Forward. And what Heartland Forward were able to do is really look at the rate of entrepreneurship amongst Black, Hispanic, and women entrepreneurs, all with a lens to say, where is venture aspiring rising? And what can we learn by looking at a perhaps new model around understanding and identifying opportunity areas for entrepreneurial equity? The second was Penn State University, and we wanted to look with them through the Evidence to Impact Collaborative at state level policy analysis. Now, I'm sure for many of us right now, we might say, is policy really a leading indicator? Obviously, it has a very big influence on the state of entrepreneurship at large. But in an unprecedented time where more dollars are flowing from federal and state levels to support economic outcomes within regions, we believe that there is a lot that we can learn around where policy is influencing the good, the bad, and maybe the neutral in this in a positive way. And finally, the center took an initiative within this phase to try to understand what are the entrepreneur support models that are being implemented across the United States. What can we start to see at a thematic level with these organizations who are really building incredible capacity for entrepreneurs to not only start, but retain that talent within these regions? And the good news is there were 4 clear thematics that emerged. And these are what we're going to talk through today when we get to the case study piece in just a little bit of time. The first, perhaps not surprisingly to all of you who find a place that you resonate with and call home, you must know where your regional strengths can fuel innovation. Slow down to understand talent, recognize the unique capacities of that talent. And that in turn is really going to not only inspire, but ignite innovation opportunities within those regions. The second, KPI-driven innovation. It's key. I think all of us know we can't improve what we don't track and what we don't measure. But inevitably, as we work through these last 12 months now of looking at inspiring leaders who are really building equitable outcomes inside of states, inside of cities, there were KPI clarities that drove them forward each and every day, were shareable, and allowed them to measure and improve those conditions. The third thing is, and again, why we're all here today, collaboration. It not only drives lasting change, but it is critical, truly critical, to being able to build forward amazing opportunities for founders. What we saw with inside of innovative models of public-private partnerships is going to be discussed a little later on today, but it does give us a better ability to understand who needs to be at the table to really be able to foster and create capacity differently when resources are hard to come by and the entrepreneurs' literal livelihoods are at stake if we don't get this right. And finally, as with everything in entrepreneurship, it's not a one and done moment. Experimentation is what strengthens not only these data models, but all of us. And that's part of our hope and part of our commitment for this process. We recognize not everyone has anything yet figured out when it comes to advancing equity in entrepreneurship. And as I have a feeling you'll hear in just a moment, while we've come some ways, we still have quite a distance to go when it comes to inspiring data sets to come together differently than we've done in the past. And in that lens, we need to have continued experimentation and continued feedback loops for the lived experience of those founders who trust us and are ensuring our ability to be able to be thoughtful partners in making it more possible for them to access the capital they need to grow and expand their businesses. When we do these things, we start to see radical outcomes occur. And so to go a little bit more into the detail, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment as I have a chance to introduce 2 very dear friends now at this stage and people that inspire me and help me learn and see the world differently each and every time. Please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to our special guests. We have Jonas Cruz joining from Heartland Forward. He's the Research Director for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and Michael Donovan from Penn State University, Evidence to Impact Collaborative. EIC is author, research professor of social science and public policy, and he's director of international partnerships. Now, they're each going to be presenting for a few minutes on their findings and the contributions that they've made so far into this 2-year initiative. We're 1 year in, so don't worry, it's not all fully baked at this stage. You'll hear from us again, I promise. But without any more delay, Cass, I'm delighted to welcome you today. I'm going to put that screen share back up, and we're going to go through some slides and some insights. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Hey, everybody. For some reason, my camera suddenly decided to go in and out. Oh, we're back. We're good. So yeah, I am Jonas Cruz, and I lead Heartland Forward's research. Let's go back one slide, Nicola.
Yep, no problem.
All good. Yeah, I lead Heartland Forward's research on innovation and entrepreneurship. And so a lot of you may not have heard about Heartland Forward yet. So I'll give a brief description. So we are a nonprofit, what we call oh, camera froze again. I'm doing air quotes right now, a think and do tank, based in Bentonville, Arkansas, focused on helping economic developers and policymakers make decisions that improve the quality of life in the center of the country, or what we call the American heartland. So we provide that assistance by conducting research, such as the work I'm presenting today. So that's the think side of the think and do tank, and also running pilot programs to implement our research findings on the ground in heartland communities. And just really quickly, we define the American heartland as start up at North Dakota, go down to Texas, go over to Alabama, and then go up to Ohio and Michigan. There's a 20-state region right there we consider our American heartland. All right, so our role in the Venture Equity Project has really been to map out the places that are helping to create the most equitable entrepreneurship outcomes for Black, Hispanic, and female founders. The overall project focuses on equitable venture funding, and we really would have loved to focus on identifying places producing the most equitable venture outcomes. Unfortunately, that's not really feasible right now, at least for Black and Hispanic founders. It's really in part because of how far we currently are from venture equity from those two groups. And it's really hard to start having conversations around best practices, specifically in bringing about venture equity when that's the case. Additionally, we're also pretty far right now from having complete data sets on deals going to Black and Hispanic founders. That's a challenge. And the reality is when we document venture capital deals right now, there's not a clear way of documenting the race and ethnicity of the founders receiving the deal. So because of this, we decided to instead focus on identifying which places produce more equitable financial outcomes of entrepreneurship. In other words, which places have created environments where Black, Hispanic, and female entrepreneurs are most able to attain a higher income than they would have if they hadn't gone down the path of entrepreneurship. So we focused on financial outcomes really for two main reasons. First, I think we're all interested in venture equity to the extent that it can bring about wealth equity. Now, obviously, venture equity has the ability to close the wealth equity gap very quickly. But, in the absence of data on venture, I think it's reasonable to focus on outcomes that do directly relate to wealth changes. Second, we also hypothesized early on that positive financial outcomes were a sort of prerequisite to positive venture outcomes because there would be little incentive to really attempt to build a business without the potential for positive financial outcomes, regardless of whether or not there were venture outcomes. All right, slide, Nicola. All right, so what is exciting is that we were able to actually use data PitchBook has been working on over the past few years, identifying female founders in their database to actually test this hypothesis of, at least for this historically underserved group of founders. And excitingly, what we found, I just said excitingly, 2 straight sentences should work on that. What we found is that an increase in female founder financial success actually seems to be a leading indicator for female founder venture success. So at least for female founders and potentially for other underserved founders, an increase in the number of founders achieving financial success is a good proxy for an increase in the number who are venture ready. Now, I'm not qualified to give investment advice. You should not construe this as investment advice, but I would take note of that relationship if I were an investor in the audience. So honing in on this figure that's up on the screen right now, so that the y-axis is really looking at the share of all venture capital deals in a state going to businesses co-founded by female entrepreneurs. And then, so that's the vertical axis. Now the x-axis or the horizontal axis is plotting the share of all financially successful entrepreneurs in a state that are female. And we do see that positive linear relationship. And for those of you that are fairly comfortable with correlations, we do see a correlation there. And one could start to make an argument that the states with low deal activity relative to financial success, so the states that are kind of hanging out more toward the bottom right of the figure, are actual the ones that pose the best investment opportunities for those looking to invest in female co-founded businesses, or frankly, businesses that are just good investments. And so you're probably thinking, how do I figure out which states these are? Well, luckily for you, this is actually a screenshot from an interactive visualization available via a link in the report. And in that visualization, you can actually click on the dots to see which states the dots correspond to. Slide. All right, so let's dive into who performed best in our entrepreneurship success equity metrics. So I think first things first, I do know DC is not a state. I know at least that much about geography. Fortunately, I did grow up in Alabama. We probably get made fun of for our lack of geography knowledge. I don't know, we get made fun of for a lot. But yeah, I do know that. However, we effectively treated it as a state equivalent for the purposes of our analysis. And the thinking was really, there are, DC's population is actually larger than that of Vermont and Wyoming. And so with a population that's really non-negligible, we should consider the entrepreneurship equity situation. So focusing more on these lists, I don't want to dive too far into each state in the top five. We'll hit a little bit more on that later, but I do want to highlight a few things. So first, there are multiple states in these lists that are actually among what you might call the nation's top up-and-coming venture hubs or entrepreneurship hubs or tech entrepreneurship hubs. And in particular, we see Florida there, Texas, Georgia, and Colorado. And Florida and Texas really have been the talk of the entrepreneurship world since 2020. And I'm going to make a dad joke here. I feel like the Florida conversation has felt a little bit like a Universal Studios roller coaster ride, but all the same. So meanwhile, I think when we think about entrepreneurship, we tend to think about three states that are actually not on the screen. And those are California, New York, Massachusetts. And that brings up an interesting hypothesis that we actually want to explore over the next year. And that's that our entrepreneurship ecosystems that have grown or developed or matured more recently, inherently more equitable than the ecosystems whose entrepreneur support infrastructure was formalized multiple decades ago, in the case of like Silicon Valley, New York, and Boston, when maybe our national culture back then was potentially less equitable than it has been more recently. And I want to make one more comment about Florida. Florida has the third largest Hispanic population in the country. And so it's actually a really awesome, like really good thing that they perform, they're the best performer in Hispanic entrepreneurship equity, because that means that, effectively a relatively large population, a relatively large share of the total US Hispanic population lives in the best state for them to create a financially successful business. I do want to stop here though and add a word of caution. While this slide does identify the best performing states in our equity metrics, we are still pretty far from equity for Black, Hispanic, and female founders, even among these top performers. So while we should look to these states on this slide when seeking best practices and moving toward equity, we do need to understand that no state on this slide is particularly close to achieving equity right now. All right, so what's next? So looking ahead, we want to spend the next year building on our work, trying to better measure venture readiness and entrepreneurship success equity broadly, and trying to understand why certain states are producing more equitable outcomes than others. So please view the work that we've done so far as a sort of check-in with folks on the ground, putting in the effort to create more equitable entrepreneurship ecosystems. So we welcome any feedback you have on the work up to this point. And also, if you have any hypotheses on the key drivers of entrepreneurship equity, things that might actually go about closing that equity gap, please let us know. We'd love to consider evaluating them. All right. I guess my camera never actually came back and you all just stared at me staring off into space for the last 10 minutes, but I will now transition to Michael. You want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me there? All right, I got the thumbs up from Nicola. Perfect. Well, I'm Michael Donovan. I'm the Associate Director of the Evidence Impact Collaborative. I'm also an Assistant Research Professor of Social Science and Public Policy. It's kind of straddled between the Social Science Research Institute and the College of Health and Human Development at Penn State University. Lastly, I serve as the Director of International Partnerships at the Edna Bennett Pierce Prevention Research Center. Uh, in my EIC role, I really facilitate and participate in these kinds of collaborative projects between the academic community as a sector and external partners. So I'm really loving to engage in this one as a multi-sectoral engagement, looking at foundations and philanthropic organizations and nonprofits and the like. So it's a wonderful example of this work. Prior to my role at Penn State, I served in the U.S. federal government as a special assistant to President Obama during both administrations. So I try to keep a mindset from a government perspective, which is a bit of what we're going to talk about today. Before I start into our efforts around the Venture Equity Project, I do want to give a big hat tip to all of the hard work of our broader team, including Jillian Somerville, Yoon Sung Her, Jonathan Wright, as well as Meg Small and Max Crowley, who supported in some previous events related to the Venture Equity Project. It's really wonderful to be able to connect with our various groups across sectors, as I mentioned. And today is really about highlighting the importance of geography as an ingredient in equity. Really thinking about how to evaluate each U.S. state and how it shapes opportunities for Black, Hispanic, and women founders. So throughout the talk, I'll go through a little bit about data sources. I'll talk about our approach, as well as some methods, as well as some findings, obviously. So as Nicola mentioned, is policy a leading indicator, right? Well, we all know that government at different levels of our political systems play a critical but very complex role in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Understanding government actions is really essential for effectively advocating entrepreneurial equity to lawmakers. So our approach in this work was to take on a really comprehensive analysis of state level legislative activities, as well as social media discourse pertaining to entrepreneurial activity. We leveraged some customized artificial intelligence tools, ultimately with the aim to understand the impact of state governments on entrepreneurial equity. To do this, we analyzed state-level entrepreneurial legislation from 2013 to 2023 through a data platform called Quorum. So it's on the slide there. It's really typically used as a public affairs software system to track legislative activity. But we have been able to work with them for multiple years now to really get behind the scenes on some of their tools and their data sets. And by employing Boolean search terms, we were able to pull relevant legislation and social media that had terms that were connected to entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial legislation, which ended up into a tranche of 1.4 million pieces of state level legislation that ultimately had some addressing of entrepreneurship. So once we were able to establish this kind of subset of entrepreneurial terms, we leveraged ChatGPT-4 and OpenAI API to really process and then analyze this data. And then our team ended up creating what we call the NEC Entrepreneur Legislation Assistant to support qualitative analysis. And I'll talk about that more in just a moment when we get to the qualitative component. So Nicola, can you hit the slide? Thank you. So getting to our findings, right? What are we here for? We found that over the last decade, between 2013 and 2023, only 1.6% of the 1.4 million pieces of state level legislation were introduced that addressed entrepreneurship. In that tranche, though, we found that Virginia, Ohio, California, and Wisconsin led the legislative action on entrepreneurship over those 10 years. So we saw that Virginia, which is 1,350 individual pieces of the state level legislation, Ohio with 402. Sorry, I'll go in order here. At California with 837, Ohio with 402, and Wisconsin with 342 introduced the most entrepreneurship related bills relative to all the legislation that the state introduced. For the year 2023, so not looking back the last 10 years, Washington State, Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Washington, D.C. Again, we're treating Washington, D.C. as a state for many of the similar reasons that Jonas mentioned. They introduced the most entrepreneurial legislation relative to all bills for 2023. In addition, we sought some sort of measure of legislation that considered racial equity in entrepreneurship. So we have seen that this has been growing in priority across a variety of states, and particularly Minnesota, Massachusetts, DC, and South Carolina across the 10-year period that we looked at. Overall, 23 states and DC introduced legislation that considered entrepreneurship and race between 2013 and 2023. And over the course of the last decade, as I mentioned, this group, Minnesota, Massachusetts, DC, and South Carolina, actually introduced the most relative to the total volume of bills introduced in the state. So again, if we're not looking at the 10-year look back and we're looking at just 2023, Washington, South Carolina, Minnesota, and Alabama introduced the most entrepreneurial legislation that considers race and ethnicity relative to all entrepreneur bills introduced in 2023. So we found also that legislators in Delaware, Puerto Rico, Illinois, and Connecticut really were leading the conversation on entrepreneurship. So previously we were talking about bills and legislation, articles of legislation that have been going through state houses. In our analysis of social media posts, we found that mentions of entrepreneurship in legislators' feeds doubled from 2013 to 2023, from a very meager 0.3% of all posts in 2013 to 0.6% in 2023. So still meager, but effectively a doubling of the discussion. And however, while the topic still represents a very small portion of the overall content, like I mentioned, we do see a leading in growth in that space. Importantly, considering the world that we're currently living in, we really do see that our analysis found bipartisan support for entrepreneurship. This is an important takeaway overall. Over the last decade, both Republican and Democratic parties produced a relatively similar volume of overall bills, although the Democratic Party did introduce 1.2 times the volume of entrepreneurship-related bills when you compare that to the Republican Party, but relatively similar volume. The gap between the parties has closed in around 2023, so it actually evened out to be more bipartisan, suggesting that entrepreneurship has even increased in its saliency as a critical bipartisan issue. So that's a very important takeaway here. Nicola, could you hit slide, please? So another component of our analysis involved a kind of a qualitative approach. So drawing from Heartland Forward's analyses, we also did this kind of informal evaluation of entrepreneurial legislation that was introduced by some of the high-performing states over the past year. So we're talking about 2023. This allowed us to kind of identify some successful models, policies that can be replicated or adopted to promote greater equity in other regions. So this is how we can look around opportunities to replicate this concept in other geographies. So we were looking at legislation particularly from 7 different states. So we looked at Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Michigan, North Carolina, and Texas. And here we did that referenced earlier, the NEC Entrepreneur Legislation Assistant. We did an AI-supported qualitative analysis that indicated what types of legislation it addressed entrepreneurship again from 2023. So we found through these 7 states, this grouping of 7 states, 435 bills addressed entrepreneurship. Illinois led the pack there with 114, Texas with 102, Michigan with 59, Maryland 53, and it goes through from Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina with 19. But most importantly, through this qualitative analysis, we were able to understand a little bit more of the texture and of the content of these bills as opposed to just the magnitude of their activity. We really were able to see some common themes that were coming out through the AI-supported analysis. We really saw a couple pieces here. So I have these kind of up on the slide here. In particular, we saw common themes come out around labor law and employment and innovations in that front. We saw a growth of tax incentives and various financial support mechanisms. We saw an understanding of education and workforce development and professional development as important drivers that were being implemented in legislation. Similarly, we saw small business and economic development as particular efforts driven from this legislation. Really importantly, we saw healthcare and social support as important factors that these states were implementing related to entrepreneurial activity. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We also talked about environmental protection and sustainability in these groups. So these are themes that we're pulling out of these 435 bills. Consumer and business protections came through, as well as technological and digital regulation came through as some of the common themes across this. So what this really shows is it seems to show an increased consideration of socioeconomic factors across this type of legislation that we've seen from these leading states. It's really understanding kind of a more of a focus, an increased focus on the holistic needs of entrepreneurs in general, recognizing them as human beings with families and needs and trajectories and backgrounds and backpacks that they carry in various ways. So some of these examples really include some great programs like Illinois. There's a statewide paid family leave insurance program. Maryland, where there was a Healthy Maryland program that provides a form of universal health care for specific groups. And there's a tax credit for specific hiring of high-tech graduates in Georgia, which we wanted to highlight as well as an interesting mechanism. So Nicola, could you hit the next slide, please? So I'll talk a little bit about some of our conclusions and things we've been able to pull from this. But I want to mention that this work, like any good effort, builds on past efforts, including the Pay Ownership and Valuation or POV project. This was an opportunity where we were able to identify female entrepreneurs who reported basic economic stability factors like income, food access, and access to health and childcare as limiting growth factors. This shows through at the socioeconomic dimensions of some of this legislation that was put through. We also had venture equity project years 1 and 2, which we thankfully are in year 3, where we were able to look at some of the quantitative methods. So this is some of the growth from this earlier work. This included funding and legislative indicators. Some data sets we used for that are the Kauffman Foundation indicators, which we're happy to put references to those summative reports into the chat as well for you all to check out. So just kind of wrapping up, what does this work highlight? What does this do? So it highlights the urgent need effectively to expand equitable entrepreneurship models for underrepresented founders. This collaboration overall has yielded several key lessons that we can be applying to future projects. And as Jonas mentioned, that this is we need to be careful about our initial findings and recognize that this is a work in progress. So there are many more opportunities in the future. We are really seeing that this highlights the importance of geography as playing a really powerful role in shaping entrepreneurial equity, emphasizing the need that spatial factors come to affect economic disparities, and also importantly, the holistic needs of entrepreneurs as human beings, family members, mothers, fathers, brothers, etc., sisters, etc., all the things. Secondly, this project I think really showcased, and this is what I love to do in my role. I get to do the opportunity to integrate diverse perspectives. So We have the potential to bring in different mindsets, different approaches, and come together as a collaborative research team to understand this, recognizing we all bring something different to the table. So that's been a really wonderful opportunity for this. Ultimately, this is about evidence-based strategies for this really pernicious challenges. The root of this, and we'll talk more of this as we go along, but this really highlights some of the opportunities around how entrepreneurship can break intergenerational cycles of poverty and give more control over their own economic output. But recognition of the larger socioeconomic context is really important. And by this kind of evaluation and some of this continued work, we hopefully are able to identify certain intervention points, right, where we can actually model different ideas that are being experimented with in different geographies that can be employed in different settings. And lastly, I mean, the one thing I love about this opportunity, talking about how different members of these collaborative groups are able to bring in their own competencies and abilities, it's really important to disseminate this kind of valuable insight out to the world and in national and international settings. So we're very grateful to our partners for amplifying the message, and we certainly hope that that you all can become amplifiers as well as we go forward. So with that, I think maybe we'll talk about future directions, kind of as a group, maybe, Nicola.
Yeah.
So I can hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Michael and Jonas. Just incredible research. I can't wait to dig into it a little bit more with you. But first, I want to take a moment to just maybe slow down 1 second and look at some of the case studies that the center had a chance to dive into with our incredible equity innovation leaders. And we love all the states out there, meaning that we are inspired to see everybody on a list soon, we hope, where equity innovation leaders are rising and shining across the United States. These are the 7 that showed up in that first 2-year body of work and have continued to catalytically be affecting positive change in advancing equity and entrepreneurship. We define that as being in the top 50% with last year, with fiscal year 2023, with venture capital activity. We also looked at the alignment to geography insights that had come up in year 1 and year 2 that we discussed earlier on. And then, as Jonas has referenced and as Michael's work has touched upon, really looking at high rankings for Black, Hispanic, and women entrepreneurs, not over-indexing to just one. So all of these 7 are showing promising trends and promising performance across the 3 identities. And as you've heard from everyone that has been thoughtful around the disclosures and the rightful articulation, we recognize and appreciate that right now, this is still not the fully inclusive identity understanding of equity in America. And our hope from these conversations, convenings, and so many more is that we can start to really build on a much more expansive data understanding of all identities for entrepreneurial equity in America. But for now, let's dig into those 7 and just sort of reflect on the case studies. This is my PSA. If you haven't yet downloaded that report, please make sure you do so. It's so good. And I get to say that not just because I've learned so much from the contributors that have participated, but because there's some just incredible key takeaways that I promise you can put into action tomorrow as you're thinking about alignment with other organizations, syndication of great opportunities, and so much more. So from Florida, we had a chance to learn beside Miami-Dade Innovation Authority. With Georgia, we really looked at RICE, the Russell Innovation Center for Entrepreneurship, and the ION District. If you haven't checked them out, and again, similar to Miami-Dade, just amazing work that's going through. Within Illinois, with the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, they have an incredible public-private partnership that is unfolding. And similar in Maryland with TEDCO. Out of Michigan, Invest Detroit emerged as a real inspiring leader that we could learn from and see some of those themes that we have already talked about. And in North Carolina, NC IDEA, just an amazing foundation that is really committed to advancing change within the region and sustainable change. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in just a few minutes with the conversation that's going to follow. And Texas, ION District and Rice University as well. So as we look at these leaders from a few of these places, there were a few key questions that we wanted to look at. And this is where I want to open up the conversation. And this is also your chance. If you have questions, it's a great time to use that chat function. Start popping them in. We want to get to as many as we possibly can from each of you attending today. And that's really this. What was surprising to us? What questions left remain unanswered, right? You already heard from Jonas, like, we're just getting started, and Michael too, like, what's next? What else do we need to learn? We were curious about this too, as we looked at these regions. And then equally starting to wonder and being curious around the levels of inspiration that we were hearing from peers as well. Who were they inspired by? Who did they look up to? What were they seeing being done differently to do more with less, which in entrepreneurship is always the name of the game, whether you're an entrepreneur or an entrepreneur support organization. How do we do more with those who are doing so much to enrich our communities, to really build home for our communities? So I'm going to stop there. I've stopped share. Michael, Jonas, I'd like to invite you across the 7 states, across the 4 that I just quickly rambled through. What was maybe 1 or 2 examples? And Michael, I'm going to put you on the spot first, and then Jonas, I'm coming right to you. What was 1 or 2 examples that really jumped out to you as like, wow, that is so innovative. That is so interesting. And obviously, please feel free to address through the landscape of policy, but equally, in general, as you were looking through the data, what was inspiring to you? What surprised you in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are quite a few kind of things that if we really unpack it, it's more intuitive in a lot of ways. And I think one of the pieces that that has really struck home by much of this work is recognizing that the kind of sociocultural kind of supports that some of these states in our qualitative analysis really showed to be valuable, right? Particularly, looking at the statewide paid family leave program in Illinois, thinking about, this is, if we could have an application of this across other polities, other states, in other settings, what could this do to alleviate burdens that are serving as rate limiting factors for folks to grow, to be able to expand their efforts and to really lean into their endeavors. So I really was struck by the variety of mechanisms as well that came into play, recognizing that the states are this wonderful laboratory for innovation in terms of policy mechanisms, in particular, tax credits versus a recognition of healthcare concerns or childcare concerns. I think that really was a valuable contribution that you can get at this point of supporting entrepreneurs from multiple ways, multiple perspectives. I thought that was valuable.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think you touched upon this kaleidoscope of issues that really pertain to entrepreneurship. And I think all of us would say, oh, the complexity of a bill on any given day is like so much to even try to seed through. So to be able to have some of these thematics emerge, not only inspiring, but I think address a lot of these quality of life effects. And we always know, from nearly 100,000 entrepreneurs now, they build in community, with community, for community. The reasons that they are an entrepreneur, despite all the reasons not to be, in many ways are pertaining to the basis of where they call home and the opportunities they see to connect and flourish within those homes. So some of these ancillary, dare I say, even more critical areas relating to some of those thematics were really inspiring to see emerge. All right, Jonas, I promised I was coming right over to you. What surprised you? What were you like, oh my gosh, I had no idea as you dug into the data?
Yeah, I think maybe to take a step back a little bit, I was almost most surprised by just like the diversity in the states that were toward the top of our ranking, so to speak. I think that's really interesting. I think sometimes you go into this and you have some preconceptions, and frankly, I think it would have been easy to have the preconception that California, New York, and Massachusetts, in addition to being top states for venture, were going to be the top states for equity. And we really didn't see that. We saw all sort of shapes and sizes of states, all different parts of the country. I mean, Oregon and Washington perform well in some areas. And then literally the opposite side of the country in Georgia and Florida also perform well. There weren't any sort of like industry specific patterns. I mean, you had states from, again, like Washington as a state and Arkansas as a state are two industrially pretty different states. Both performed well for one of the historically underserved groups that we focused on.
Yeah, yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, one of the elements that you've touched upon that has served as such a deep moment of curiosity for us, I think, as we all continue on this, is it true that in some regions that are newer, if you'll indulge, to venture entrepreneurship, that there's almost less bias organically built in, less of that, quote unquote, pattern matching to overcome, because they are building with an understanding of their base, perhaps differently than some of the other locales that I'm not going to call out and point on here. But I think, there is this differential within some of these regions that you're looking at. Yeah. So what are you missing? What do you wish, if you had a magic wand today that you could pull in to an understanding of how to really better understand advancing equity in entrepreneurship in America? What do you wish you knew today that you can't yet answer? Jonas, I'm going to start with you this time. Sorry, you're right on the hot spot again.
All good. All good. No, I think it's a few things. I think some of these we can do. It's just going to take time, and others are more difficult. I do think we need to start thinking more and more about how can we get a truly representative data set of the deals going to, not just Black, Hispanic, and female founders. And as I mentioned, the data on female are getting better every day, thanks to some of the work that PitchBook's been doing, but other founders as well. I mean, one of the reasons that we do believe that it's really important to focus on Black and Hispanic and female founders. These are three very large in the US historically underserved groups, but there are other groups of founders out there we'd love to focus on as well. And frankly, the reason we haven't been able to generally relates to lack of good data. And I think in general, just increasing the data out there, trying to get better at figuring out a way that we could safely and without bringing in potential for discrimination and bias, start to track things around the race, ethnicity, sex of founders so that we do have a better data set that we can look on. Because I think the hope here is that we and others that are looking in the space are going to be helping to close the equity gap. And as we close the equity gap, we need to be able to track that closing of the gap so we can really see what's working and what's not.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In the first phase of the work that we did with the Venture Equity Project, one of the key findings and somewhat worrisome findings was that so much performance had been put on the early stage of providing capital to founders, meaning that friends and family seed round, that first level of funding, the bias was still continuing all up and down the capital stack. And of course, Michael, that's directly over to the work that y'all did with the Binder Oaxaca findings there. But maybe on that note, I'm curious, as we commit and promise to really being able to track and try and improve the data set, make sure that we're eliminating bias and track and trend over time, what other ingredients would you love to see come together right now? What do you wish you knew that you can't yet point to through the landscape of policy or just broadly around advancing equity and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and I think you hinted at it there. One big piece is I would love to be able to do a little more of a longitudinal analysis on these trends. So, we were able to look at from a quantitative perspective the last 10 years as a look back. We did a deeper dive on the qualitative work in 2023, but being able to see what policy innovations are being employed in different locales over time, and then ideally trying to find different proxies to tie those to economic outcomes. Like how is this working in this this geography, and how has that led to some other pieces? So that involves I think a bit of the work that Jonas is referencing. I think understanding how deals are being made and where and what kind of overall metrics of economic precarity and growth, as an opposition, thinking about that would require, a deeper dive, for sure. I also would love to think about, we're treating these states, and Jonas mentioned it as well. Like there's quite a bit of diversity across the types of states across various dimensions. And I talked a little bit about the bipartisan nature as well. So we can, as that what that means in a very changing environment in the U.S. But at the same time, it'd be really interesting to delve into within state level issues. So metropoles versus rural areas. We're obviously seeing lots of diversity in economic dynamism. So that would be another approach that would be really interesting to get into.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, ultimately, I have to say my third title is Director of International Partnerships. I'd love to see some comparative work in other settings, right? I mean, we can learn from the work being done in other countries, and there's no no comparator to the U.S. in many respects, but it could be really interesting to expand in that domain.
Yeah, no, 1,000%. I mean, from the micro to the macro, I think you've covered the wish list in a really good wholesome set. And to be fair to our founders, again, I would say they are working in an international world each and every day, whether it's talent bases, customer bases, supply chain, the list goes on and on and on. And so we do have a role and opportunity and a little bit of a responsibility to make sure that we are seeing through the lens of effect and positive support for them. And I guess I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't also add maybe one thing to the wish list, and that was a way in which we could have a little bit more of a knowledge stack, so that we could over time seed historic understanding of where things have leapfrogged, and also maybe taken a step back so that we don't step and repeat, right? I think we've all lamented, well, this looks a lot like X. What happened the last time we did X? Was it a good thing, a bad thing? I think anecdotally, I heard from a few people it was good, but then equally, I've heard from a few people it was really probably. So we just don't have yet that rigor, that analytical capacity to be able to go back in a more informed fashion and look thoughtfully at the investment of dollars, literally the investment of dollars going to technical assistance, going to mentorship, going to capital that is actually positively affecting opportunities for diverse founders in America and beyond. And so that's the wish list here, is let's actually start to have more of a distributed knowledge stack that people are contributing to, yes, but also equally, we have a little bit of machine learning capacity to understand what works and what doesn't work in a way that we have not historically had. It's a lot of that gut check. And as we know in entrepreneurship, when the gut starts checking, a lot of the time the bias starts creeping. So, let's work on that if we can here too.
And I might add,
Yeah,
one
sorry,
more
please,
wish
yeah.
list. One more wish list, going to the Q&A from Anand.
Yeah.
I love this idea, and I know we were not able to really employ a larger social network kind of analysis or node analysis. That would be really fascinating to go into, and that would be something around the membership of the NEC programs, right? That could be an interesting approach in future. So there's untold opportunities. It's just about hours in a day, right?
Oh, that one denominator, none of us are changing. How many hours are there? Well, I want to try to get to a couple of these questions because Anand was a great one. There's so many good ones, and thank you all for participating. Let's start with this question around, we focused on venture aspiring here, but there's a great comment from Tim. CDFIs might actually be also an equally interesting capital allocator to look through, and whether or not they are supporting more diverse entrepreneurial outcomes here. Jonas, it kind of falls a little bit into your domain because I know we've struggled a little bit with this too. Like the venture data is not yet there. So what other indicators might we be looking at in wider capital considerations? Where are you thinking with some of these other capital providers? And is that on the roadmap of like, I'd like to look at that further too?
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about this is generally one thing that we need to do is we need to demonstrate to venture capital firms that they're missing out on really good returns. So we need to look at CDFIs. We need to look at ways we could cleverly allocate SSBCI funds that were just released, and some of those have an equity angle. in the future, if we get another tranche of SSBCI, similar things, ways that we can utilize all the works going on with the NSF engines, because there's a lot of times there's an equity lens in a lot of those plans that got approved and funded. I think just different ways we could take advantage of some public-private partnerships and some alternative investment instruments to actually prove that, these ideas that are coming from the Black and Hispanic communities and are coming from the unique perspective of female entrepreneurs are really good ideas. And they may not look just like the ideas that we've traditionally funded, but they're going to give you real returns and they're going to have massive impacts on the world. And you should be investing in them.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. There's a lot on the horizon right now around the care economy that I think we've all been wistfully wishing had happened a while ago. It's often lamented as a bit of the cottage industry, and certainly the capital that has gone more towards the care economy has been CDFI and others. And yet it's such a massive, massive critical part of the overall function of this country, and certainly for our entrepreneurial base. And so as we look at the returns that are being generated there from great organizations like Mission Driven Finance and others, I think it's more and more optimistic that we're going to start to realize returns look different depending on sector coverage, but are equally critical to the rise of all venture aspiring businesses in America. Really great. Okay, I've got one last question I'm going to try to squeeze in before I close this out today, and it's this one. The role of support organizations and resources and mentorship. Amy asked the question, is there a differential that you observed anecdotally or showing up in the data yet around which states are performing differently when it comes to the relationship between entrepreneurial support organizations and equity in entrepreneurship? Any observations? And I'll open this up along with your final thoughts for today. Michael, do you want to start us?
Yeah, this is a challenge because there are many dimensions to look at. To the particular question around healthcare, for example, there are some interesting mindsets around, for example, that program I mentioned in Maryland that is doing quite a bit of growth and support, recognizing that that healthcare is a major impediment. We didn't do a robust comparison list because there are many factors in play. And one thing I didn't really reference to, which in the world of public policy and public administration is the big scary word of implementation. Every one of these policy mechanisms are not necessarily going to be implemented with fidelity to a model across different, so there's lots of challenges for evaluation. I could certainly go into it, dig a little more and get you something more specific, but I don't know if I have anything perfect off the top of my head. Maybe Jonas has.
All right, Jonas, no pressure.
Yeah,
Pretty
I would
easy.
say, this actually touches a little bit on the Raj Chetty related question that was brought up as well. So we actually spent quite a bit of time last year helping the city of Memphis on the ground with trying to break down some barriers for the Black community as it relates to entrepreneurship. And what you're alluding to is actually exactly what we found, is that what you sometimes don't want to do is to silo your ecosystem into these are the ESOs for the Black community. These are the ESOs for the Hispanic community, because there may be situations in which you need an ESO that can solve for specific problems that Black entrepreneurs face. But frankly, a lot of times, especially as these startups mature, they're going to have industry specific questions and industry specific problems, and they're going to have funding related questions, which really covers, that's a question that's going to come up for all types of startups. And so the ability to break down those silos and really view these entrepreneurship ecosystems as this holistic group where everyone can work together, relationships can help the rising tide raises all ships, or something like that. That sort of idea, I think we need to view ecosystems more cohesively.
Ugh. What a perfect way to end our time together. It does take a village. We started with that saying, I'm so glad to be in this village with incredible partners like Michael and like Jonas. Thank you both so much for your time and for your insights and your expertise today. Friends, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you for participating in the research. We have just started a new monthly newsletter that aims to actually continue to accelerate and distribute new insights, inspiring stories. Please sign up for that newsletter if you're interested in continuing this work. We'll look forward to, I hope, welcoming you to another great webinar on the Venture Equity Project, showing some of these case studies in more detail very soon. Wishing you a wonderful week, the rest of the week ahead, and thank you for all your support. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.